Hi, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can use Musio with Ableton Live 9. Musio is a product developed by Cinesamples that gives you access to a massive collection of some very high-quality virtual instruments in one simple, easy-to-use, and highly affordable plugin. Cinesamples released this product as a standalone application and as a plugin that is available in AU, AAX, and VST3 plugin formats. Since there is no support for VST3 plugins in Ableton Live 9, and since AU plugins are exclusive to macOS, I figured that the only way I am going to use Musio in my projects is by routing MIDI from Ableton to Musio, and then routing the audio from Musio back into Ableton for recording. You can think of this as an extension of the tutorial I did a while back on routing MuseScore's MIDI output to Ableton Live via Jack Audio Connection Kit and Loopbe1, because I'm pretty much going to be using the same tools for this tutorial. Loopbe1 is a free virtual MIDI driver or internal MIDI device for transferring MIDI data between computer programs, so you're able to connect the MIDI output of an application to any other application's MIDI input. Jack Audio Connection Kit is a professional sound server API and pair of daemon implementations to provide real-time, low-latency connections for both audio and MIDI data between applications. Another application that you can use is Voicemeeter. Voicemeeter is a free virtual audio device used as a virtual I/O to mix and manage any audio sources from or to any audio devices or applications. The first thing I'm going to do is to go to the folder where Jack is installed, locate the Jackserver application icon, right-click, create a shortcut which will be placed on the desktop. Once that is done, I will right-click on the icon and modify the target field. When you modify the target field of a shortcut, you are essentially creating a command that will be executed when you double-click the shortcut. In this case, I'm setting the target field to this. And what this command does is it starts the Jackserver with real-time scheduling, synchronous mode, using the port audio backend, the UMC ASIO driver, and a buffer size of 4096 frames. Starting the server using this method is similar to starting it from the command line, because the parameters you add to the target field are passed to jackd when the shortcut is used. Using the command line offers flexibility and is useful for testing different configurations quickly. Using a shortcut is convenient for regular use as it saves your configuration and allows you to start the server with a double click. Both methods allow you to pass parameters to the server and are therefore effective, so you can choose one that best fits your workflow. Alternatively, you can use a graphical interface like QJackCTL, which allows you to configure the server by clicking on Setup. And here you can adjust all the settings to your preference. Now I'm going to show the graph window and keep it open because this is where I will be making all the connections between Ableton, Musio, and my sound card. Now heading over to Ableton, I already have the project that I will be using for this tutorial open, and it's basically just a string quartet with first violins, second violins, viola, and a cello section. I have not loaded up any instruments on each of these MIDI tracks because the sounds that we are going to be using are going to come from Musio, which we are using in standalone mode. The first thing I'm going to do is to set up Ableton to use Jack Router as my audio device. And what this does is, if you go back to the graph window that we opened in Jack, you will now see that Ableton is listed and connected to the interface as expected. The next step is to set up the MIDI preferences, and here we are going to enable the output for the Loopbe1 internal MIDI device, which is already installed and running in the background. The reason we are doing this is because we want the MIDI that will be coming from each of the tracks in our project to be captured by Loopbe1. Once that is done, we're going to go to each of our MIDI tracks and configure the MIDI outputs for each of them, starting with the violins. If you click the MIDI 2 selector, you will be able to see the Loopbe internal MIDI as a MIDI output because it is enabled in our MIDI preferences. Once we've selected it, we're going to specify the MIDI channel that MIDI coming from this track will be sent through, and for this we are going to select channel 1. We're going to repeat this for every track, making sure that we select a different MIDI output channel for each. Now we're going to head over to Musio and load up the instruments that we're going to be using with our project. For this tutorial, I will load Violin 1, Violin 2, the viola, and cello instruments from the Cinesamples orchestral strings library, which I have already downloaded. Once all the sounds are ready, I'm going to go to the settings and select Jack Router as my audio device, just as I did in Ableton. And again, what this does is, if we go back to the graph window that we opened in Jack, you will now see that Musio is now also listed and connected to the interface as expected. The next step is to choose the MIDI input that we're going to be using, and in this case, we're going to select Loopbe1, which we've already set up to capture the MIDI output coming from Ableton. As you can see, our MIDI controller is also listed here because the standalone application allows you to play instruments directly from any MIDI controller that you may have connected. The last thing we need to do on Musio is to configure each of the instruments we have loaded to receive MIDI through the channels that we set in Ableton. So now that we have everything set up, we can do a quick test to see if everything is working as expected. If everything has been set up properly, each of the instruments we've loaded up will start receiving MIDI through the assigned MIDI channels, and you will hear sound going through the Jackserver to your sound card. In case you're not getting any MIDI coming into Musio at this point, you might want to open Loopbe1 to make sure that the MIDI port is not muted. Now, since our goal is to use the sounds coming from Musio in our project, the final step of this tutorial is to route the audio coming from Musio back into Ableton for recording. To do that, we're going to create an audio track and call it Audio from Musio. The next thing we're going to do is to connect Musio's audio outputs to Ableton Live's audio inputs via the graph window. Disconnect Musio from the system output so we can monitor the audio through Ableton. which is also connected to the sound card. And when we go back to Ableton, we can now record audio coming from Musio. You can of course do this for individual tracks if you wish, but for this tutorial I will record all the incoming audio in one track. And that is how you can use Musio if you are on Windows and if you're using Ableton Live 9 or any previous versions as your DAW. This also applies to any similar applications that you may not be able to load within your DAW as VSTs, but that come as standalone applications and that allow you to configure audio and MIDI preferences as we have done in this tutorial. The other alternative is to upgrade my DAW, but since I am not able to do that right now, this was just a simple workaround. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.